Rez Dogs, chapters 8 through 10. Chapter 8, A Moose Story. When Malian walked back into the house, Grandma Frances motioned for her to sit down. She pushed the bowl of dried moose meat over toward her. "Have some of this, granddaughter. It's good for what ails you." Malian smiled. That was what her grandmother always said about whatever food it was that she served. It's good for what ails you. "This is from the moose that your great-uncle Philip shot last year. It was a good big one that decided to give itself to him." Her grandmother paused. Malian said nothing, knowing what would be coming next. "I ever tell you the moose story?" Malian was pretty sure she'd heard it before, but no way was she going to tell her grandma that she'd already heard it. Not only would that have been rude, it might have ended up with her grandmother not telling the story at all. Plus, even when she was told a story she'd heard before, there was always something in that story that was more. Part of that might be because every storyteller had their own way of seeing a story without really changing it. Or maybe it was because of what her grandfather often said, that all the old stories are so alive that even when you hear one of them again, that story may decide to show you something new. "I would really like to hear that story," Malian said, picking up a piece of moose meat. "Well," her grandmother said, "there was this family of moose all sitting in their lodge around the fire and relaxing. Then all of a sudden, what came floating in through the door of that lodge was a pipe, trailing smoke behind it. None of those moose reached out at first for that pipe. They knew what it would mean if they took it. But then one of the young bull moose said, 'I'll be the one to take that pipe.' He reached out for it, and as soon as he touched it, he was no longer in that lodge. He was running through the snow. Behind him was a man on snowshoes. With those snowshoes on, he not only kept up with that young moose, he gained on it. Then, when that hunter got close enough, he stopped and lifted up his gun. Seeing that, the young bull moose turned to give the man a good target. Then the man fired. The next thing that young moose knew, he woke up, back in the lodge, unharmed. He looked around at the other moose. He said, 'You see, it's a good thing to accept a gift like that. Whenever a human hunts that way, it's good for us to give ourselves. That way he only takes our meat, but does not harm our spirit.'" Grandma Frances paused, looked straight at Malian, and that is why she said, "We got this moose meat today. Your Uncle Philip offered a gift of tobacco as he asked that moose to share its body with him." "That is really good," Malian said. "Is it okay if I take a piece out to Malsum?" "Here," her grandma said, "take two." As Malian walked outside, she thought about how hearing a story told that way made her feel good, reminded her they were still part of something good, something older and longer lasting than the moment they were in. They might be forced for now to stay home because of the virus, but their spirits, like that of the moose, were still free to travel. And the old connection remained between them and the natural world always around them, a world that could give itself to you if you just did the right thing. "Like sharing this meat with you," Malian said to Malsum, who sat patiently, wagging his tail as she held out the first piece of the moose meat to him. Chapter 9, Potatoes. It was raining outside. Malsum was nowhere to be seen, but Malian could feel his presence. There was a place he'd found just under the porch where he went at night and in weather like this. There he could still look out and keep an eye on things as their self-appointed protector. The weather was still not warm enough to plant anything in the small garden her grandparents kept out back, but this rain would be a good thing. Even if it turned into snow, that would still be good, putting moisture into the earth. "This rain sure is cold, just might turn to snow," Grandpa Roy said. "You know, sis, grandchild, early spring snow like this, we call white manure, fertilizes the ground where it falls. Makes me wish I'd already put some of my potatoes in." Malian watched the cold raindrops splashing down on the black plastic her grandparents used to cover the mulch on top of the garden, the heat breaking it down into good dark earth. Cooking it real good all through the winter was what Grandpa Roy had said. Potatoes, Grandpa Roy said, sort of half to himself. Always the first to be planted up here. You know, potatoes came from Andean folks up in the mountains of South America, where it gets a lot colder than this. They had hundreds and hundreds of kinds. Problem in Ireland when they had that potato famine I mentioned the other day. Reason that all their potatoes died from the blight was that they all grew just one variety. Ireland, Malian thought. I used to dream about going places like Ireland and Spain. But maybe now the way the world was, those were places she would never go. Then again, she thought, I've already traveled more than most kids on the reservation. Some never even got as far as the state capital, and she'd been to New York and Boston, and even that one summer, all the way to Disney World in Florida. Malian wished the other kids on the res had the opportunities she'd had. And now, through the stories her grandparents were sharing, she was getting to travel in another way, feeling her spirit travel through time, being part of something so much older, so much deeper. But still here in the physical world, she could not leave her grandparents' house, and right now she couldn't even get online. She looked again at the screen of her iPad. No bars were showing. That meant she could not be part of lessons her teacher had planned for the day. She wished that their internet connection was better. It was tough here on the res, getting much of anything, and the internet was no exception. There had been a new tower about to be put in not far from the res that would give better service to everybody here. But work on that, like work everywhere, had just plain stopped 2 months ago. For some reason, the internet worked better at night. That was how she was able to link into Netflix and watch things with her grandparents. Right now, what they were mostly watching were those old episodes of Star Trek. Her grandfather put his hand on her shoulder. Really coming down out there, isn't it? Malian just nodded. After spending all this time with them, she discovered she didn't have to say much at all. Her grandparents always seemed to be able to know what she was thinking. This here rain, Grandpa Roy said, puts me in mind of one of our old stories, the one about the good planter. Want to hear it? This time she answered out loud. I would love to. Well, Grandpa Roy said, there was this man named Notkikad. That means the planter in our language, you know. No matter what happened, whether rain or snow, whether sunny or cold, he always gave thanks to the Creator, and his crops were some of the best. But this one year, everything went wrong. First there was frost, killed everything he planted. He planted again, but then it got so hot, everything dried up. Then, when he put in almost the last of his seeds, big flocks of birds came in and ate up everything. But there was still time for one last planting and just enough seeds left. They grew pretty good, but then, wouldn't you know, an early frost came and everything all shriveled up and died. Even so, though he figured he and his family might starve over the winter, before he went to bed, he said a prayer of thanks to the Creator. A cold wind was blowing, and there was snow in the air, but that night, as he slept, he had a good dream. In that dream, he heard a voice saying to him, I will give you a gift of new seeds and a special time to plant them. When he woke up, there at the foot of his bed was a bag of seeds, bigger seeds than any he'd ever seen before. He went outside. It was sunny and warm, and the snow had melted away. He planted those seeds, and just as soon as he put them into the ground, they started to pop up. The sun kept shining, and it stayed warm for the next 7 days as those plants kept growing. By the end of that week, he saw that he'd have more than enough to feed his family for the entire winter. Just as soon as he finished harvesting those crops, the weather changed and the snow came back in. Grandpa Roy chuckled. We don't have any of those seeds now, but our Creator still gives us that special time of year, Nibbun al-Noba, a person summer. The white people call it Indian summer. As her grandfather finished the story, the rain had stopped. Malian looked up. In the sky to the west, a rainbow had appeared. We call that the coat worn by the rain, her grandfather said. I take it as a sign that tomorrow I ought to put in some potatoes. From under the porch, a loud woof came, as if Malcolm was agreeing. Then Malian heard a soft ding from behind them. She looked back into the house. There on the table, where she always worked, the face of her iPad had lit up again. She had 2 bars and time enough to get in to the last half of the day's lesson. I guess Grandpa Roy said that device of yours likes seeing a rainbow too. Woof! Malcolm barked again in agreement. Chapter 10, Pictures. Malian sat between her grandparents on the porch swing. The big photo album was in her lap. Photo albums. Every native family at Pennacook had one. It was a warm late May day, the first one over 70 degrees since the snow departed. The 3 of them sat looking at the first picture in the album. It was of an old man with a handlebar mustache. Just about every man here in Pennacook had one of those stashes back then in the late 1800s, Grandpa Roy said. They were the style then. Then he chuckled. Sometimes I think men grew them just so that they wouldn't look like all the white people thought us Indians ought to look. Clean-shaven and wearing a headdress like Sitting Bull. He shook his head. Or maybe it was also because back when all of us men were kids in the Indian school, we had our hair cut short and had to dress in uniforms. Growing a mustache that way was kind of a statement that we were going to look the way we wanted and not the way other folks wanted us to. Her grandmother gently rested her hand on the page where that photo was pasted. This man was your great-great-grandfather, she said. He was a chief and an author, too. Malian nodded. She'd read his book. It rested now back in its special place as the very first book on the top shelf of her grandmother's bookcase. Her grandmother had copies of every book written about their people, and in fact, just about every book written about any of the Native American nations of New England. Most of them were by white people. Which is why you want to read their books, her grandmother had said. Not because they got it right, but because you always want to know what they are thinking about us. Grandpa Roy had laughed long and hard when she said that. Did you know, he said, that all us Wabanakis are anal retentive, whatever that means? That's what one of those ethnologists decided. Malian ran her finger along the crinkled edge of the album's dark cover. Can we look at the pictures of you and Grandpa when you were my age in school? Her grandmother flipped the pages to the photographs of 2 children. Their faces dead serious, they stared at the camera. The short-haired boy who was her grandpa was dressed in a military uniform. The girl who'd be her grandmother wore a long, shapeless dress. These were the pictures sent home to our parents, her grandmother said. That was the only way they got to see us because we were kept at that school month after month, year after year. Malian bit her lip as she thought about that. It was so hard for her to be away from her own parents now. But she knew it was only until things were safe and they could talk over the phone and see each other's faces on their screens. Just that morning, she'd done FaceTime with them. First her mother and then her father, holding the phone and smiling up at her. I miss you both so much, she'd said, then found it hard to talk. Are you okay? Her mother asked. Then as she nodded her head, forcing a smile onto her face, she managed to say that things were good, that she really loved being with Grandpa and Grandma. You're our warrior girl, her mother said. Then her father, who always seemed to know what she needed to hear, spoke in his storytelling voice. Malian, do you know who you remind us of right now? The one in our stories who is called the Woman Who Walks Alone. She's the one who teaches the birds new songs, who makes a bed of moss on the mountaintop to watch the stars swirl through the night, or sleeps with the bears in their dens. The one who needs no man to tell her what to do, although when others need help, she is always there. They talked more after that, but that story was all she needed to remember, to remind her just how lucky she was. What would it be like to not even see your mother smile or hear the soft voice of your father telling you how proud he was that you were taking care of Grandma Frances and Grandpa Roy? Just the thought of that made her heart want to break. Her grandfather ran his bent index finger over the picture of himself in the album. Can't really say it was all bad. Made some of the best friends I ever had in that school. He lifted up his finger and looked at it. Them nuns left me some souvenirs. Every knuckle on both my hands got broken one time or another from being hit with that heavy ruler Sister Anna Louise always kept in her pocket. Her grandmother started flipping pages, stopping when she came to a picture Mallian loved. It was the first picture ever taken of her father, a chubby baby being held up high by both her grandparents. "We called him the miracle baby," Grandma Frances said. "Last thing we expected was to have another boy after we both turned 40. But he was a blessing, and your uncles and aunts were like second parents, all of them being 10 or more years older." Grandpa Roy let out one of his deep chuckles. The only ones upset were the Indian Health Service. They thought for sure they had made certain your grandmother wouldn't have any more children. Mallian found it hard to understand how people could do something like that to another person, but she kept listening to what her grandparents thought she needed to know. "Back then," Grandma Frances continued, "when your father was born, it was still common for the Indian Health Service to make it so that Indian women could not give birth to any more children after they had had 2 or 3. Whenever a woman went into a free clinic, they'd offer to do a full health checkup. And when she woke, they would not tell her what they'd done, an operation to prevent her from ever having more kids." Mallian turned another page and then stopped. It was hard to believe what she had just heard and what she saw. "Looks just like him, don't he?" Grandpa Roy said. Mallian nodded. The picture with the year 1918 written on it showed a man in an old-fashioned army uniform with a dog by his side. "That man there is your great-great-grandpa Arthur Bowman. Picture was taken right here at Pennacook before he went overseas. He called his dog Wolf. Wolf just disappeared and was nowhere to be seen after Arthur got on the train. You know," her grandmother added, "funny thing is that while he was in France, he had another dog that just showed up and got adopted by his unit. Looked so much like his, he called it Wolf too. Stayed by his side until the day before the war ended, and he was to be shipped back home. Wolf too was just gone that very next day." But when Arthur got back to Pennacook, can you guess who was waiting by his front door? Malcolm had been sitting out by the mailbox, but as soon as Grandma Frances stopped talking, the big dog came trotting over. One big leap brought him up onto the porch. He put his front paws on Mallian's knee, leaned in close, and stared at the picture of her great-great-grandfather and the dog named Wolf for a long minute before turning to rest his chin in her lap. Grandpa Roy reached over to scratch behind the big dog's ears. "Some of the most loyal folks I've ever known have been dogs," he said. "They always find some way to come back home."